This is going to be a specifically a conversation about climate change. Other Christians to help people understand the importance and working on it. We are going to short videos by a woman, Catherine Hayhoe Foundation, and Catherine Hayhoe, I'd like just to read. Her videos are wonderful, and she is a really impressive woman. She is the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, which I am very, very high. Professor in public policy and public law, and Paul W. Horn, distinguished professor. She has some lovely stories about Texas. She has been named one of Time's 100 most influential people. She serves as World Evangelical Alliance, which constitutes over 600 million members. Catherine was a lead author for the U.S. second, third, and fourth national. She hosts the PBS digital series Global Weirding and has written for the New York Times. What can do to fight climate change? Just talk about it. Has been viewed by over 5. She has a bachelor's in science and physics and astronomy from University of Toronto and science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We'll be doing 2 of her studies per session, and this first, what the Bible says about the natural world. And the general question I want to throw out first, your understanding from the Bible of how God views the natural world. So something, we'll see if I can get this to go. Okay. Hopefully the volume will be good.
Sunday school child. Came to give us spiritual life. But I don't know about you. Second greatest gift might possibly be. And I don't know that we necessarily have to agree how. Definitely somewhere in at least the top 3 or 4, we have to consider this planet. This planet is what provides everything we need for our physical. Especially, for example, from the letters written by the Apostle John, we know that the physical does. We were never created to float around in the emptiness of outer space. That gives us the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the food that we eat, the material, every single thing that we have. This planet, incredible natural beauty that surrounds us. And it is, God takes great pleasure in his creation, whether it's the small aspect of it, or whether it's a distant galaxy or nebula far away. Teacher, as well as a teaching elder in our local church, was known for, when people use slides, he would have a slideshow that he would take around to churches and organizations, and he would show people the things that we're only starting to see with the most powerful telescopes that we have. And he would refer to those things that God created simply for the pure pleasure of their beauty. Something, and even still, we know there's so much that we haven't seen yet. But we as humans are told that we have a special relationship. So in Genesis 1, chapter 1, first book of the Bible, it says, God said, let us make. And that verse has a reason attached to it. No mystery, it follows immediately from this. It is so that we can rada every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. Now, rada has been over, but rather than argue over what the proper translation, this word used elsewhere in context lends new meaning and clarity. For example, in Psalms, this word rada is used, and it refers to a godly ruler. May he what? In order to oppress, in order to extract all the resources for gain? Of course not. May he rada to deliver the afflicted also, and him who has no helper, to have compassion on of the needy he will save. So the word rada is clearly those that do not have the resources and the ability that we have. And then man into the Garden of Eden too, and the words here are abad and shamar. I do not speak Hebrew, but these words mean to serve or to protect or guard. Connotation of stewardship. Imagine if we were given a piece of respect more than anyone in the world, and that person has invested in that land and cares deeply grass or insect on that land. And imagine if we extract every penny of value we can from it and leave it a crushed. Imagine if we took that land and we invested in it, we took care of it, we made sure that it could produce crops, it could feed people, it could provide habitat for animals and plants. Here's the interesting thing though. All nature or creation is other than us. So we read that and we assume that means that we're to care for every living thing, plants and animals. In our society today, the Cambridge Dictionary defines nature, plants, rocks, etc. in the world that exist independently of this barrier between people and nature. We are living things too. And so when we were told to care for all living things, that is not all with humans as well. Traditionally, we have often an egocentric perspective. An egocentric perspective puts humans on the top of on the rest of nature. And we know that in the Bible, the concept of resting your feet thing implies conquering enemies. It does not imply a rada. But then in the world, when they say, oh, well, humans are just one of every living thing. We believe that we do have a special role, but that special role is to protect, to guard, to keep all living things, including
We talk about Genesis. Do you want? Yeah.
Humankind are image according to our likeness, and the sea and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle and over all the wild, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind. God, he created them, and male and female created them, and he blessed them and said to them, subdue it, and did not have them, and have dominion over the fish and the sea and every living thing that moves on the earth.
Thank you. So I guess the question people interpreted this word rada, or
I'm just using the word subdue. Nowhere has it ever said destroy, I don't think.
Yeah.
That's a lot of what goes on. But
And else, you think?
I mean, even when I talk to young children at school, they often animal, that we're a form of an animal.
And I wonder what God thinks of that. Now, when we say that she talks about being the egocentric versus, you think that that's an important point to me?
egocentric versus what?
Echo, the ecology,
Oh,
ecology of the world.
God says it is good, you know, but have houses to go to cold and or heat or, you know, nature. We also have sprays that want to get rid of that we don't want to see or
Weeds.
eat our house.
yes.
So she showed, there was the one that was the circle and the human was pieces.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's typical. The person sees their role, like, I don't think we put ourselves as just. So,
Oh, that's, yeah, no, the dogs are people too.
Do you remember the book we read, neither dog nor, a lot of indigenous people do feel that equality with their surroundings. Cool, I think, with their surroundings to feel that way.
Diagram that we saw, that was where. Oh,
Right, with a little heart-shaped thing indicating that humans are taking care of everybody else.
That was a,
Okay, gotcha.
Okay, that was what we're hoping to be, where we take care of everything else. So eco, not G, but
you
C.
were just there was a circle like
okay.
around the
The
end.
egocentric.
Yeah. Because sometimes you'll hear people say, well, you know, God won't let anything, you know, God will take care of everything. We should leave it up to God. And there's all the way through it, things like we've got to take care of this world. So it's not, God's not going to come sweeping down and say, okay, let's fresh start. I think throughout the whole thing is this feeling of stewardship. There's other ones, like Jeremiah 2:7 said, I brought you into a fertile land to eat its fruit and rich produce, but you came and defiled my land and made my inheritance detestable. So I think, I don't know, how do you feel when people say God will take care of things? Have you ever heard somebody say that? Who's very,
It's a cop out. I mean, just like they take care of it, he'll take care of me. I don't need a COVID shot.
yeah, yeah.
well, and I think that if that's what has to happen because humans don't step up and fix this, if we leave it just to evolve, it's going to be ugly and dark and horrid for a long
all those dystopic movies we've seen.
I've
Oh, yeah.
I've also heard that we don't need to do anything, science will take care of it. It's just an excuse for continuing the same lifestyle and not changing at all, or accepting change.
I also think people say, well, we can't, human beings are not powerful enough to change the earth. And I always go back to the, and we're all old, well, John, you may not be old enough for this, but do you guys remember the ozone hole depletion?
Yeah.
78 from the CFCs?
Mhm.
And at that point, the world came together and said, if we continue this way, we're going to destroy ourselves. And the ozone hole is still there, but it's getting smaller and smaller. But that took a worldwide concentration. And then science kind of did save it because they came up with refrigerant substitutes and all, but it's still,
Well, but in that case, our country led the way,
yep.
and
Oh.
the rest of the world followed.
That was 99-0 in favor of going to the Montreal conference that versus this time for the Paris conference. Paris Treaty, yeah, it's kind of a different world we're living in now. All right, so good. Let's do the next one. Excellent. It's going all right, huh?
You're hired.
Oh, thank you. I remember someone at our last church said, what are they gonna do, fire you? You screw up. All right, so now,
Somebody else would have to do it.
then look at this, you see, look at that, goes right to the first one now, right?
Right.
The reason why we care about a changing climate is not because a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 degree increase in the average temperature of the entire planet really matters that much to any one of us. It's because that temperature increase, like the first domino in a row of dominoes, kicks off a series of interconnected impacts and events that affect all of us around the world, but affects the poorest and most vulnerable more than any. The single best description I've heard of climate change was coined by the US military, if you can believe it, and it's this: climate change is a threat multiplier. In other words, it takes all of the other issues that we already care about, all of the issues, for example, that are exemplified by the Sustainable Development Goals, issues of poverty, hunger, lack of education, basic healthcare resources. It takes these issues and it makes them worse. Another way to think about it is with this image of a bucket with a hole in it. We're pouring all of our efforts into this bucket to alleviate poverty, hunger, disease, lack of access to clean water, refugee crises, and more. Yet that bucket has a hole, and the hole is getting bigger and bigger over time, and there is no way to fill the bucket if we do not patch the hole. The hole is climate change. I care about climate change specifically because it does affect the poorest and most vulnerable in the world. It's no accident there's a direct correlation between people who are already living in poverty and people who are most vulnerable. Because how climate change affects us is by loading the weather dice against us. In the places where we live, we know that we've always had heavy rainfall, floods, heat waves, hurricanes, droughts, storms, wildfire, and more. These are a normal and natural part of life on this planet. But the warmer it gets, the more frequent or the stronger and more damaging these events are getting. We know that the frequency of heavy precipitation is increasing. We know that heat waves are getting more extreme. We know that droughts are getting stronger. We know that wildfires are burning greater area. We know that cyclones, hurricanes, or typhoons, all the same storm, they're just called different names in different parts of the world. We know that they're not getting more frequent, but they're getting much bigger, stronger, slower, more powerful, with a lot more rainfall associated with them. And then there's the long-term changes, like creeping sea level, with 2/3 of the world's biggest cities, many of those in developing countries, lying within just a meter of sea level. So why does climate change matter? It matters precisely because it disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable in the world. If we have a flood in a rich country, it can be devastating. It can produce very expensive damages. But if they have a flood in a developing country, as occurred, for example, 2.5 years ago in Bangladesh during the monsoon season, where due to the abnormally heavy rains, a third of the entire country was underwater. The impacts can be beyond belief. Where I live in Texas, we experienced a massive record-breaking drought in 2011 and 2012. Where we live is, climatologically speaking, very similar to Syria. And in Syria, they also experienced a drought that's estimated to be 2 to 3 times more likely as a result of the changing climate. But that drought was occurring on top of an unstable political system, on top of poverty, on top of ongoing conflict, a pre-existing internal refugee crisis, all of which led climate change and its impact on the drought to be like the final straw on the camel's back. You can have a healthy camel that doesn't have much on it, it can absorb that extra straw. But if you have a camel that is malnourished, underfed, in poor health, already overloaded, that's when climate change can truly be the final straw that breaks the camel's back. Another example, and this is the exact same event this time, was Hurricane Matthew. Hurricane Matthew hit the Carolinas in the United States in October 2016. It produced billions of dollars worth of damage, and it led to the loss of 28 lives. Now, those are very serious impacts, but before it hit the coast of the United States, it hit, which is the poorest country in all of Central North America. In Haiti, the headlines look like this: we've lost everything. In Haiti, they already had cholera, and the epic flooding that resulted from the hurricane exacerbated the cholera epidemic. In some places, up to 90% of people lost their homes. All across the world, since the 1960s, it's estimated that the economic gap between the richest and poorest countries has already increased by 25% due to the impacts of a changing climate. And this past year, the United Nations warned that climate change threatens to undo the last 50 years of development, global health, and poverty reduction. We care about climate change because it is a threat multiplier. Climate change is not only an environmental issue, climate change is a poverty issue, it's a hunger issue. It's an issue of inequality and injustice. Climate change is a human issue, and that's why we care.
So what do you think about that? The Pentagon has been watching climate change for at least 20 years now, not because they're great environmentalists, but because it is a harbinger of political instability, which affects us, and terrorism. And it's kind of like if the US military considers this a dire threat, I'm not sure why every human being in the United States doesn't also. But so what kind of protection do we have in the United States against these climate events? You name a couple? Insurance, yeah.
FEMA.
FEMA, yep.
A wall along the southern border.
You say, sorry?
A wall along the southern border. Well, they didn't talk about immigration and the effects that it's going to have on immigration, but that's partly what the military is looking at. And it's what everyone ought to be considering. I mean, people were really concerned about immigration, legal and otherwise, and climate change is going to make it a whole lot worse than what we're looking at today.
And there's big economic implications too, because we pour more and more money into the effects of climate change on, the vulnerable, and everybody really. But I mean, it costs a lot more when we have extreme events.
I think about her bucket.
Yeah,
That you keep putting holes in the bucket and pouring more and more money in the top.
yeah.
Well, we just look at the amount of dollars being spent on just the wildfires, not if nothing else, billions.
Yeah.
Well, on top of that, you've got, when hurricanes come, all the
Yeah.
houses are destroyed. And so that, there's need for lumber. So we've got to keep cutting trees. And so it just gets bigger and bigger of a problem.
And it's economic, it's, whether it's FEMA or insurance or people suffering loss that's not insured, it's still a loss. It's still billions of dollars and it's increasing.
Mental health and despair. I mean, so many things.
And it becomes a political issue.
I think one of the things we tend to do in the United States is, given that we have such a huge land mass and wealth, there's a tendency to think, oh, well, I can just move over there, or I can avoid this somehow, or it's not going to hit here. Imagine if we lived in a small landlocked country or a small country on the sea that was rising. Like, that's the end, that's finite. And here we can kind of just push it down the road a lot because, we have so much. So this definitely highlights urgency. Yeah.
And then to the poverty thing, you don't have money, it's hard to move.
You have to remember the response to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans versus the other places that it hit. There's still not, people still can't move back.
There's still people even living in FEMA trailers from clear back then.
Yeah.
I read an interesting article a couple of years ago, I think now, but there's England has just had its first city where they basically said, here's the end date. We're no longer going to do anything else to save this place. And it's going to be in the ocean and we're going to quit trying to fight it because we can't afford it. And when you read the articles about how people were reacting, it's kind of just exactly what you said, Vicki, which is, this is a rich country. All of these people have options. And they're basically giving them 30 years notice that, this city isn't going to exist anymore. So you need to find some place to go. And, we aren't doing any of these infrastructure things that we've been doing for decades to keep this place alive. And you compare that to some small village that's, 1 meter higher than sea level. They have no resources and they're not getting 30 years warning. The storm hits and it's gone. They've got no place to go.
Kind of brings to mind Highway 112 out to Nia Bay.
Oh, yeah.
With the continuous
Yeah.
landslides and the rising sea, and there are parts of it that, you just, here's the cliff and here's the ocean and you're here.
Well, and the Quileute tribe is having to kind of redesign their village to get away from the rising of the sea. So
Then they move up,
They moved to their
Yeah.
school.
Yeah.
But they can, but what about
but they
New
have the
Orleans?
resources.
And
Yeah,
Miami?
what about,
New Orleans and Miami, we have huge cities that are at sea level.
Well, then you take Bangladesh, they said 1/3. Bangladesh, maybe, have you been there, Tom?
No.
And I haven't not been there either, but most of the country is basically sea level.
yeah,
So it's
And
crazy.
really poor.
Oh, yeah, very good.
I haven't been to Bangladesh, but I've been to India and it's just a whole lot of.
When I was teaching, we would have people coming over from India, students and all. And when I would talk about this in class, this was chemistry and society, and I remember a young lady standing up and saying, you people in the United States have no idea. We are already been experiencing climate change for a long, long time. And she says, all you have to do is look at the number of suicides of farmers. Because we can't feed our family, they can't feed their families, and it's just been horrific. And you're the richest country in the world and you're dragging your feet and you're making, I can't remember what the percentage was in the 90s, but it was something ridiculous, like 60% of the emissions were coming from the United States, and maybe not that much because China was doing all right too, but yeah.
I remember 40 years ago, about India, that you have like a small plot. And, if you have several, like 10 kids, they've got to live off that one little plot, which is pretty small. So what happens is that they all leave the land because they can't be supported and they go to the city. So, and then the city gets more and more people, And then when rain comes, I remember going through the major city and it was like a big river, My car was floating.
Seriously? Oh, my gosh.
They finally got the sewer system worked out so they could suck
Yeah,
out
'cause
the water, but
that's not
my,
pure water, is it?
no.
The poverty in India and such places, but I guess India is what I'm more familiar with, contributes to human trafficking. Parents actually sell their kids, daughters especially, into slavery because they can't feed them. They figure, well, if they have food and a roof over their head, they're better off than if they were with their parents. So that's it's really awful, but it does relate to what we're talking about.
And from a Christian point of view, I mean, I think God's orders for us are very clear about taking care of the less fortunate. And that's something I don't think any Christian would argue with.
In one of the congregations that I served in Eastern Washington, they were farmers. Really a neat man. His wife had died sometime before I got there. Very wealthy. Who gave a lot of money. But one of the things he would never give to is any hunger appeal. He felt hunger was just a natural way of eliminating population issues.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, my God.
It was
sounds like
crazy.
Scrooge,
Yeah,
die
but-
now, decrease the surplus population.
Yeah, I mean, it was crazy. It was crazy.
I think so much that too many times it doesn't affect us.
Mm.
We know climate change, we're gonna have longer growing seasons, we're gonna have longer times for allergies because plants are growing longer. It's gonna affect us, but we're too egocentric, I think, in the sense that if it doesn't affect us or our country,
Oh,
then it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, too many other news does accent some of that kind of stuff. I still come down, it's all about me, attitude, which is totally horrible.
About 5 to 7 years ago, I can't remember the exact time, I was in Uganda on a mission trip with a church from this area. And we went to a Christian co-op of farmers who were raising coffee beans. And it was really interesting. They said they had for a long time been struggling with how to adapt and change because the weather was constantly changing. And they were already very much aware of the fact that they had to change. They had to adapt.
I guess you were mentioning about long growing season. Greenland's pretty happy, because so much of the ice has receded that they now can have cows or cattle because. Yeah.
The wine industry in France is failing and, the area of, or the wine is being grown in England or, the UK because it's of climate change.
And I think those of us that are gardeners, just think about this last year here. I lost a lot of plants during the freeze, but I also lost plants when it was so darn hot. And now we've got probably the coldest April we've had in how many years? I'm afraid to plant my petunias.
Yes.
So we see it right here, and yet we think it's over there somewhere.
It's easy for me to feel hopeless as an individual, like I try to reduce my use of plastics. I try not to drive unnecessarily, but I'm like, what else do I do?
Well, that's what's nice about coming together as a community in the church. This whole thing about, it's a term called community efficacy, that you get more efficient if you use as a group. And I can quote you a wonderful statistics that, 100 companies account for 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions. But as someone said, this is such a huge problem that got to approach it from the top down and the bottom up. There's a wonderful story in her book about, was it Shell Oil? And to fight back against all these people yelling at them about fossil fuels, they came up with this idea about your personal carbon footprint. And that's pretty much in our vernacular now.
Yeah.
But somebody in their group thought this up in order to put the blame over on the individual. So you felt so guilty about everything you did. And she breaks it into 6 groups in the United States of how people feel about climate change, from the really alarmed to the dismissive. And luckily the dismissive is just 7%. Those are the ones who are like, oh yeah, and want to get in your face. But she said, if the people in the top 25% who are concerned or alarmed cut their carbon footprint in half, that would constitute a 6 to 10% decrease in emissions for the United States. But if these large companies did, we're talking about over 50%. So you have to keep that in mind about all this and how you can impact. And we do impact. I mean, BP doesn't even call them British Petroleum anymore, because they're touting how they're into alternate energies and doing all these things. And ExxonMobil is touting how they're doing all these different things. Now, it did go back in the dark ages of 2016 to 2020, but they will be, well, I think what we need to concentrate here too is some happy stories, because they're all around us. We can't get in a mire thinking that there's no hope, because there's huge amounts of hope.
Could you say that again? How many 100 companies?
Are around the world, so we're talking about Chinese and all, account for 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay.
And for example, CO2 is the most prevalent, well, water is the most prevalent as a greenhouse gas, but we can't really control that. So CO2 is the most prevalent, and then methane gas, which is 200 times got the efficacy of, or the power, warming power that CO2 does. Depends on the molecule, how the molecule absorbs radiation.
It's really water vapor, as you said, is the most common, but water vapor cycles in and out of the atmosphere in 7 to 10 days. And the carbon that we're dumping into the air is going to be there a long time.
It's really inert. That's why they didn't want to consider it a pollutant, because it was so inert. So we're going to concentrate too on the happy stories, because the big thing we want to get out of here is not to be afraid to talk about it, and the steps of how to feel comfortable talking about it. She said, even people who are terribly alarmed don't want to talk about it because they're scared of pushback, or they're scared of just a negative reaction. But there are ways to very gently bring it up in the conversation, and very simply and with great stories and win-win situations, what you're looking for. So,
Does she have any strategies or advice for just local communities besides talking about it?
yes, yeah, we can talk about that too.
Okay.
That'd be good. All right, is this good?
Jane Goodall is hopeful. She says there's a place for hope. So it's not all bad. So. And I think if we as a church do what we can, I think we can make an impact.
I do too. And I think you look at places like, she's from Texas, and she talks about, she was asked to give a talk about this to the oil and gas, not foundation, but Association of Texas. She said, I'm not going. I've got nothing, they're just gonna laugh at me or be nasty. And the woman said, no, think about it. And so she walked in there and she said, I love fossil fuels. Everybody said, what? Totally disarmed them. And she said, that is why we don't have slavery. That's why that's why we can live here and have the standard of living that we have, is because of fossil fuels. It's time now to move on. We had the buggy, we moved away from the buggy and oil. Now it's time. And she said that she gave her half-hour talk and they kept her another hour asking her a question. And the woman came up to her who had organized this and said, we don't talk about this in Texas, but 21% of the electricity in Texas comes from alternate energies. People don't want to hear it, but all these people, these huge companies that we talked about, those 100 companies, most of them, I can't speak for ones out of this country, but most of those in this country are looking for the next step because they all think there's going to be a carbon tax at some point.
In the pocketbook.
It's the pocketbook, yeah. For us, I always think about win-win. For most people, it's in the pocketbook. For Christians, I think it's in stewardship and care, stewardship of the environment, stewardship of our fellow man.
What if we petition all those companies that, you know, in our own small way, just send a petition to say, do something about it.
Yep.
You know,
They get those all the time. They need to hear from stockholders pretty much before they're really gonna move. There's a certain, change is difficult, and that's what we're talking about here. And big organizations don't want to change, individual people don't want to change. We're talking about a big change here, doing away with carbon fuels.
And the voting booth too. The voting booth, who you elect
Oh, yeah.
to represent you is very big too.
so how do we reach the stockholders?
Keep that thought, because we're going to be talking about this for the next month about this. And that's what we'd like to come out of this. Her last one, 9, which I'll ask you guys to watch individually, and we'll figure out a way to get together, come up with some action items at the end of this. Because her last video is called "It's Not Too Late" and what you can do. And together, we have a much stronger voice than as individuals, I think. So, thank you. You're my straight man. Thank you. All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Barb. Good job.